Your Excellencies, dear friends, a good morning and a warm welcome to you all, and also to all those watching from around the world online. We at IPI are privileged to be hosting you for this panel discussion entitled The War in Ukraine, this frightful war of aggression, anticipating dilemmas for the UN as it strives to stop the fighting. And we are deeply honored to be joined by three highly distinguished former senior UN colleagues who I'm delighted to also call old friends. Allow me to introduce them, although they hardly need any introduction. To my extreme left, Lord Malloch Brown, Mark Malloch Brown, President of the Open Societies Foundations, who served as Deputy UN Secretary General, was Chef de Cabinet to the Secretary General and the administrator of UNDP, who began his UN career with UNHCR. To my left, Karen Lundgren, President of the Security Council Report, a former UN Under-Secretary General and SRSG of 3 UN peace missions, who also began her career in UNHCR and served with UNICEF with distinction for many years. Welcome to the two of you. We have online also Jan Egeland, Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council, a former UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, who began his career in human rights and, most interestingly, was recently awarded by President Zelensky the Order of Merit of Ukraine for his leadership and for the work his organization, the Norwegian Refugee Council, has accomplished for the people of Ukraine. Of particular importance to this discussion, he was also a chair, or he was the chair, of the Independent Senior Advisory Panel on Humanitarian Deconfliction in Syria. I myself am president of IPI. I was the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and I began my career, UN career in peacekeeping. So between the four of us, we cover all the UN pillars, and together have spent more years in the UN than we'd all care to admit, because we're not all that old. But of the four of us, only one was a Deputy Secretary General. And so, Mark, I would kindly ask you to open this discussion with some framing thoughts, and welcome back to Turtle Bay.
Well, thank you very much, Zaid, and it is great to be with such old friends. I first knew Karen when she was, I can call it that, the shop steward of UNHCR, representing we as staff in this sort of union setup. And I first knew Jan when he was the kind of world's shop steward, dealing with the world's displaced as our OCHA head. So we're old friends, as you and I are, particularly, Zaid, so it's great. I think it is worth starting with what obviously in some ways is a fairly obvious point to anybody engaged in this, which is that this is not just another war. This is a system-shaking, system-breaking conflict with huge consequences which go way beyond even the tragedy of the destruction of life and property in Ukraine itself. And I just sort of make 3 points, all of which have, I think, a common currency here. One, if you do look at it as by normal war terms, the level of displacement and refugee exodus, and possibly of casualties, where I think we're very unclear on numbers, is already putting it in the first division with a record rate of refugee exodus, particularly. But, beyond that, it's these other issues. This sort of breach of rule number 1 of our UN Charter system of, a invasion of sovereignty, a breach of sovereignty without any serious pretext at all, a sort of brazen crime of aggression. And we just haven't seen such a sort of unapologetic, direct threat, in a sense, to the system by a P5 member in the lifetime of the UN. And I think, that has to give us all cause for thought and concern and reflection. And the, and the third level of seriousness, if you like, is the threat to the whole post 1989 order, but also the post 1945 order, when you kind of have a rogue member of the P5 willing to breach basic law in this way, we're into, new territory. And I think beyond that, I say leading a foundation which isn't quite on the scale of the UN in its geographic reach, but is all over the world, that we are already seeing the knock-on effects politically and economically, which will not be contained to the region. Food prices are leaping up in places like Turkey, Egypt, Iraq, when two of the top five world grain producers are at war with each other, the impact on food prices is going to be huge. We already see, perhaps more directly ourselves, the impact on energy prices. But beyond those short-term shocks is coming prospectively a massive reordering of the global political economy, with a process of sort of regionalization of global supply chains around security considerations and political alliance considerations, which is so at odds with the sort of post 1989 globalization that I think we're barely beginning to understand its consequences, both short term for standard of living for everybody, but longer term for a completely reordered international system. So if that is the backdrop, what does it mean for the UN? And I think the first thing to say is it is seismic. As I've said, it's not just a P5 member using that privilege to sort of block appropriate condemnation of their behaviors. We've seen lots of that by P5 members over many years. But this is in a whole new category of its own, I would argue. And so what does that mean for the UN? I think the most obvious point is a politically broken UN, very much back into the sort of pre-1989 world of just a likelihood of a permanent gridlock in the Security Council on pretty much everything. Now, in that pre-1989 world, I was a young humanitarian worker for the UN in UNHCR and saw that actually there was a massive humanitarian activism. I remember the Secretary General of the time coming to visit me on the Thai-Cambodian border and being shocked to see a massive relief operation and saying to me, nobody told me about this. And I like this story because it goes to the fact that in those days, these operations did not seek the support of the Security Council and indeed preferred to operate with the relative non-knowledge of the Security Council and political New York, and instead very much operated under the parameters of international humanitarian law and a basic sort of agreement between the Soviet and American leaderships that cleaning up the human disasters around the many proxy wars of the time was a useful role for the UN. So there was space to do it. And I fear we will go back to that kind of UN, humanitarianly active, politically neutralized. But let me just very quickly add just a couple of other consequences, I think. One is, even back in the pre-89 world, we probably did not deal with the level of disinformation that we deal with today, where, the Washington Post reported yesterday polling out of Russia by the most credible pollster in Russia, showing 58% support still for the action in Ukraine by a public which has been fed a completely different version of the truth to that in the Western media. So the UN's role as a truth teller is going to become critical. It cannot pass its words in the Human Rights Council and other forums anymore. There needs to be honesty of reporting. And I think if you accept that you're politically broken, maybe that gives you the space to kind of speak truth to power. And I think that is key. The third thing is the UN needs to, in many ways, save itself from, ridicule. And I would argue this morning's session on chemical weapons is high farce. And, obviously a council member must have the right to bring issues to the council. But when the culture of council behavior is reduced to this sort of performative art for Russian primetime news programs and is completely detached from any plausible truth about chemical activities inside Ukraine, and is indeed being used as a rationale and justification for a potential chemical weapons attack against the people of Ukraine. I think we have to, really be concerned as to where this is going. And just a final sort of point on UN performance. I mean, this I think is I've known Antonio Guterres. I was, chaired the panel that made the recommendation to the Secretary General to appoint him High Commissioner for Refugees. So I've known and respected him over many, many years. But he has been a cursed Secretary General. He's had three sort of apocalypses really. The Trump years where he sort of spent his time cautious, avoiding condemnation by Twitter from the White House, followed by the sort of standstill of COVID. And now the prospect that the rest of his time in office is going to be overshadowed by a rogue P5 leader, Putin. And, that last is by far the most serious of the three crises he's faced. But it does leave us with a Secretary General who bravely condemned what happened in Ukraine, but was instantly marginalized as a consequence. And I think this is, to use a phrase others have used, a browbeaten UN. And it needs to sort of take stock of what it can do and what it can't do, and perhaps recognize that it is in the humanitarian, human rights, information reporting, and possibly coordinating with the IFIs, the development response to a global economic crisis that will follow this, is where its comparative advantages lie, and that the Security Council is perhaps condemned to remain performative black arts, followed by deadlock for years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for that very eloquent laying of the context in which we're having to view or place the Ukrainian crisis. If you'd allow me, I'd like to just read three short quotations, and I'd like the reactions, your reactions to these quotations, in particular from Karen and from Jan. The first quotation, it says, "Through error, misjudgment, and an inability to recognize the scope of evil confronting us, we failed to do our part to save people. It was as much a moral cause as a military conflict." The second quote, "The international community tried to reach a negotiated settlement with an unscrupulous, murderous regime." The third quote, "Errors by the UN were rooted in the philosophy of impartiality and nonviolence, wholly unsuited to the conflict." Now, these words were written by our former boss, the much-loved Kofi Annan, and he was writing about a different time and a different conflict. But the point he was also making was clear. The UN must think precisely and clearly, apprise the situation it faces accurately, which diminishes the likelihood of it being instrumentalized or entering into a Faustian bargain it will much regret in the future. And the UN, as you said, is arguably weaker now than it was ever before. I'd like your reactions to this, and in particular, by turning to first Karen and then Jan. Jan, if you can also touch on your report on the deconfliction in Syria and the lessons, to the extent that you can talk about this, and reflect on Kofi's comments made many years ago. But can we turn to you, Karen, first?
Thanks, Zaid. Thanks also for convening us. I want to speak a bit to the Faustian bargains and the importance of calling things out as they occur, with a framing device, because we see some of the same dilemmas recur in conflict after conflict, even if, as Mark has said, this Ukrainian conflict is different in a number of ways. But if we look at what the United Nations wants when it is confronted with a war, it generally wants four things, I would suggest. It wants respect for the UN Charter and the principles of international law. That's number one. It's always seeking that. Number two, it wants the war to end quickly, to minimize human suffering. So we could call that a settlement. Let's call it for now a quick end to wars. The third thing it always wants is for humanitarian assistance to reach those in need. And I don't mean only the material types of assistance, but also protection for those who require it. And the fourth thing I believe it always wants is justice and accountability for the crimes and the violations that have taken place. And it's my view that the dilemmas that arise tend to arise among the pursuit of these four goals. And sometimes they arise within these goals individually because of inconsistency on the part of the UN. Inconsistency when breaches of the Charter, violations of international law aren't called out in the same way for everyone. Inconsistencies in the way humanitarian assistance or protection are delivered between one group and the next. So I think it's critical as we think about these to think about how clearly and how honestly we all the time approach these four goals, if you accept my basic premise. Now, if we look at perhaps an obvious conflict between a desire to settle quickly and uphold the UN Charter and the principles of international law, we hit the obstacle of the fact that every settlement is a compromise. Every settlement is a tough bargain, and the alternative of allowing the war to continue and be prosecuted to a victory by one side is arguably worse. I think many of us will have seen the articles that were published last week, Thursday last week, by Anatol Lieven, saying, well, here are the elements of what a settlement could look like. Reading these, I was both shocked and thrilled, I would say. We were 1 week into the war, and here is someone saying, this is the outline of a settlement. But of course, it's tough to read because in that settlement would be an acceptance of breaches of the UN Charter, of territory that has been gained unlawfully and by force. And I want to read one sentence from the article that was published in The Guardian, where he says about the future of Crimea, quote, "Here, respect for international law must be tempered by considerations of reality, the prevention of future conflict, and the interests of ordinary people in the region." So this completely encapsulates the dilemma of a negotiated settlement, trying to extract a principled settlement out of a conflict such as this. The article also says that it would be, quote, morally wrong to oppose a reasonable agreement. Reasonable is doing a lot of work in this sentence, but this is your Faustian bargain, and we're talking about an outcome that is not the worst case scenario. We don't know if a settlement is even going to be possible in this conflict. I would add, if a settlement is possible, the meetings that I've seen reported between Ukraine and Russia don't seem to feature any women at the table. So a negotiated settlement doesn't look like being an inclusive settlement, even if we're fortunate enough to have one. I think we can go through these four goals and take up the conflicts, the dilemmas around justice and accountability, and they are many. I'm sure we'll come back to those, but I do want to finish with a reflection on humanitarian assistance, which was a large part of my life for some years, as with Mark and Jan. Not only are we looking at the dilemma that Mark touched on of rising prices and scarcer food supplies set against what WFP needs to do to supply those in need. But from my experience in former Yugoslavia, we had at least three other humanitarian dilemmas. One was seeing the force commander of the peace operation, tempted as he was bargaining and negotiating on the front lines to bring humanitarian assistance into the mix of things he could negotiate with. Two is precisely what Mark touched on, which is especially when the world is stuck trying to make headway on the political process, turning to the humanitarian aspects of a situation as something we are able to address. And pretty soon you see it taking the front row in the Security Council as representing what the international community is doing about the conflict. And I'm saying this as the Security Council is looking at a draft resolution on humanitarian support to Ukraine. Humanitarian assistance is massively important, but it is not the same as a solution to the conflict. And the third dilemma here, just to mention, is of course the consistency of humanitarian response across the world, not forgetting about all the other global conflicts. I think we've all seen the cartoon of Yemenis holding up the Ukrainian flag with saying something like, "Now they'll see us," crude, but absolutely to the point.
Thank you, Karen. I mean, when you speak of the four key areas that will determine the UN's approach, you haven't included the imperative of time, the way in which time forces upon us, the imperative of the moment forces upon us a certain requirement to do things, which would otherwise upsets what would be a sort of linear sequencing of the different sort of approaches that are being thought of, and it's an interrupter in chief, if you will, and then it can so easily dislodge us. Jan, I'm sure much of our audience is desperate to hear what you have to say. You've always been outspoken and clear-headed, so please take it from here.
Thank you very much, Zaid. Good to be with friends, Mark, Karen. I spoke with our people on the ground in Ukraine an hour ago. We have moved our headquarters from Kiev to Ivano-Frankivsk in the west. They spent all night in the shelter because of the air raid that was coming. When they thought it was all over and they came up, the bombing started of the airport just outside, and then the air sirens faltered, so there was no warning at that point. I'm just telling you the story because even now, the place we thought were the safest in Ukraine to have our new headquarters is seeing bombing, and they haven't slept for 3 nights. Our people there organizing the response. We have 40 colleagues in Severodonetsk in the east. It was probably taken over by the attacking forces in the next 48 hours, which means we'll have a majority of our staff on Russian-controlled territories. It's absolutely dramatic. There is no large organized relief at the moment for any of the besieged areas or any of the large population groups on the move. We're all doing small things all over the map, nothing big. I was there in eastern Ukraine 3 weeks before the invasion. We saw the build-up. I think it has to be realized that the population that are now taking the brunt of the fighting in the east, especially, is a very vulnerable population. I've been to too many war zones. Usually 60% of those who are there are children, and our heart is bleeding to see it. But it's also pretty tough to be in a place where 60% are elderly, and very many of them are disabled, and none of the people I met along the front line have been able to flee at all. They were in crossfire, and they have now, the front line has moved past many of these people. I met this elderly lady. We had just repaired our hut finally from the last war and got electricity to her outpost village. I asked, why aren't you leaving? I mean, there's 100,000 soldiers now on the other side. And she said, can I leave? No, my husband is dying from cancer in this hut. He did repairs at Chernobyl after the, as so many other Ukrainians, after the nuclear accident. He got cancer and he's dying. I cannot leave. So maybe my starting point is the discussion before all of this on the historic borders of Ukraine, on the historic injustices, on what would be real or natural borders, the expansion of military alliances done by men like us with ties in safe offices, and the reality of the people on the ground who were really hoping to have enough money for fuel so they could have their hut heated. The distance couldn't be bigger, really. I mean, and I think it's one of the lessons beforehand. It was like this discussion was here and the reality was there, and the reality is the people now bleeding because there was no sanity in this buildup of this attack. Then, second point, I mean, what should be the priority of the UN now? I mean, at the moment, it must be to get a humanitarian ceasefire, a breather that could lead to some discussion on minority protection and self-rule or whatever, and the expansion of alliances and so on. But you cannot do that in the heat of the battle. For each and every second this lasts, the more difficult it will be to end it. It's more difficult today than it was the day before yesterday. There is more bitterness, there's more destruction, there's more to rebuild, there are many more people on the move. The anger is bigger on both sides. We've seen it elsewhere before. A word, Zaid, you asked me about that. I have been working a lot on humanitarian pauses, humanitarian corridors, humanitarian arrangements, and that the parties cannot even agree, Russians really, because it's always the stronger party that has to really organize and give here. Agree on a humanitarian pause is unforgivable, really, because it's a bloodbath in many of these places. And Mariupol is now having all of the traces of the kind of besieged areas in Syria, where it ends with horrific starvation and deprivation. Humanitarian corridors sound very nice, really, and like it's very sophisticated. It's a very crude agreement, and it has all chances of falter. A humanitarian pause for a city, 48 hours, 72 hours is the sensible thing. Use different routes to get supplies in, have civilians get out of harm's way. At the moment, humanitarian corridors are not even arranged, and it will lead to a bloodbath. Humanitarian agreements can then lead to the ceasefires that can lead to the possibilities to negotiate the issues. Shouldn't be that. I mean, we're not discussing the future of Jerusalem here. It is actually should be less difficult to discuss future of Luhansk and Donetsk and Crimea, the Crimean Peninsula. Two final points. What should be the response? Well, our response now is a threefold one. To work in the neighboring countries, easy. Poland have taken more refugees now alone than Europe took in 2015, when Europe went into hysteria because we were overwhelmed. It was 1 million people, 1.5 million, will be 2 soon in Poland alone. The relief work there is actually going pretty well because these are countries that are relatively well organized, and they are getting support. The cross-border operation still not happening because of the fighting, first and foremost, and the insecurity, but it will come massively. The work inside the country, I already mentioned, that's the third and the most important element. If 5 or 7 million leave, it could be that numbers, there would still be 35 to 37 million left. And they need our humanitarian relief, whether they are on this side or on that side of the front lines. And remember, there was a lot of needs in the so-called self-declared People's Republics of Luhansk and Donetsk as well, where humanitarians would go where the needs are in an impartial manner. The final point, I think Mark raised it, it is super important, really. It didn't get better in the Sahel or Yemen because it got worse in Europe. It got worse in those areas because it got worse in Europe. A report from our people in Sahel says that already prices of food, wheat, bread has spiked. And if you live on $1 a day and you spend 75 cents of that for bread now, and the bread doubles in price, you starve, and your family starve, and there is zero for the rest. Second problem is attention is drained then from all of what we need to do in Afghanistan, where we need the West to work with us to lift sanctions and to unfreeze funds, for example. So attention is not there anymore. We need attention back to all of these urgent problems as we respond to Ukraine. The relations will be in the deep freezer between the P5. How can we now get the resolutions on cross-border to Syria and other things that we desperately need? Help us, really, to avoid that there is worse. Karen, you also mentioned that really the hurt also explodes in the rest of the world. And finally, funding. There are phenomenal sums now pledged for Ukraine. That must be additional funding because we were overstretched and underfunding already in the rest of the world. These are my points, Zach.
Well, thank you, Jan. I mean, the first reflection was extremely vivid, and I think we needed to hear it. Could I ask a question of all three of you? I mean, granted, I mean, Mark, you basically made the case that the UN has been, and in the view of many, including myself, has been browbeaten over time. And also the perils of making humanitarian action the centerpiece of what otherwise should be a political dialogue, which Karen spoke of. Now, there is leverage, of course. If you're trying to open up the humanitarian space, the leverage is contained in the punitive economic sanctions that the European Union, the US and others have levied on Russia. But is it even conceivable that they would allow the UN the space to determine a series of transactions, that corridors would be created, or let's say a space would be created 48 hours, as you said, in exchange for relief in a certain area? Is it conceivable that the UN can control that? Or is the hand, or is the, let's say, the decision-making so entrenched now in the capitals of the countries controlling the response and in Brussels that it's unlikely that that's going to be possible? And so the UN will almost be an observer in part and a service provider when the opportunity arises.
Well, I think, Zaid, I mean, it'll be up to the leadership of the UN humanitarian active side of the house as to, how far it can or cannot expand that role. I mean, there is word out of Moscow, I think one seen reported, of OCHA being allowed to at least embryonically sort of start to establish some deconflicting mechanism. And it's interesting that it appears to be coming out of OCHA and not out of DPA, which, I think shows, where the Russians are at least willing to offer an inch of space, is to the humanitarian side. But I would suspect from my previous experiences that, there's a continuum here where I expect our old friend Peter Maurer at the ICRC has got more access than OCHA and its agency members some access, and the political side of the UN no access. And that's going to be it. And you come back to it that you can sort of artfully build up the role a bit to sort of get humanitarian corridors. But it remains, as Karen said, and Jan too, I mean, ultimately, this is sort of Band-Aid territory. It's not getting really to a solution. Now, we have seen situations where humanitarian corridors lead to enough trust building between the two sides that it does lead to a ceasefire process, which in turn leads to some wider peace building process. So the sort of, the starting with the humanitarian and trying to branch out, is a perfectly respectable strategy. But I think it does come to the implication of your question, Zaid, that the problem is this is a big power conflict centered on capitals. And I remember so well when I worked for Kofi, there was a imperious P5 ambassador at the time who would come and tell me that Iran was above Kofi's pay grade, and would I please convey this to him, which I would pick my moments to sort of lightly report, as I felt bound to do as chief of staff at the time, these things, and Kofi would sort of shrug it off and go back and try again to get some traction on Iran. And, I do think, there we had a Secretary General very confident in the sort of charter powers of his office, and certainly willing at all times to avoid the kind of public rebuke to a P5 member state that would rule himself out, but just willing to deploy the power to come off the back of that humanitarian to see if you could find a way into the political. And whether it's the Congo or other places, we were able to do that. But again, I would just say, this is a very unlucky Secretary General. He's got the biggest and worst set of crises of all. And I think it's easy for outsiders and old timers like me to, say it could be done more ambitiously. I think he's in a very tight spot.
Yeah. Karen?
I do think many of us are harking back to the 1990s in the things we know to be possible, which was a very different era in great power relations. But I wanted to say a word about the Security Council as theater, quote, which was your comment, Zaid, or the Security Council as, quote, performative black arts followed by deadlock, which please take good note of that quote. I think, I don't believe that any of the P5 want to see the Security Council as an institution degraded. They want to maintain the value of the council and not have it slip into something that becomes the butt of jokes. And they have options about how meetings such as this are conducted. The members can decide not to hold a meeting. I think you were the victim of one such briefing that members decided at the last minute should not be held. They can always decide to take a meeting behind closed doors, which they have not done in this case. So they have options to manage that process. But I think we need to keep two things in mind. One is to think of the Security Council as an outlet for some of these things. It does play that role. And if we see the council used to misinform and perhaps degrade the political and diplomatic environment, it underlines even more strongly the role of the UN, I mean the UN Secretariat now and the Secretary General, in being a purveyor of honest and reliable information. So the UN can and should be setting the record straight every time some nonsense is being spouted in the Security Council.
Yes. I mean, in this context, Karen, I read the last two reports issued by OHCHR just prior to the invasion. And they're very detailed reports, 32 in all since 2014, describing the human rights conditions throughout the territory of Ukraine, including in the occupied Crimea, but also, of course, in Luhansk and Donetsk. And it was so manifest that there's so much embroidery and exaggeration on the part of the Russian Federation. And those reports should have been mentioned time and time again as authoritative reports on the human rights conditions in the country. And it's surprising to the extent to which the UN hasn't been shouting from every rooftop that this is manifestly embroidered information from the Russian Federation. Jan, any reflections on what you've just heard?
Yeah, I mean, there is a team from OCHA in Moscow. There will be military-civilian dialogue with the Russians. We have urged that as NGOs on the ground. I really hope the UN, which will also play an impartial, neutral, independent through its staff role here, will lead on this. We will have to be able to do cross-line convoys. We will have to do cross-border convoys, and we will have to work on the other side. We will probably then work on the sanctions potentially that are now levied on the Russians that could hamper us in helping Ukrainians. There is a lot of work we need to do as humanitarians, and member states need to enable us to save lives as the politicians and the diplomats has failed to stop this war. At the same time as we have to admit again and again, there is no humanitarian solutions to humanitarian problems, as we say. There has to be a ceasefire coming from the negotiation table, and that needs to come very soon. You may remember I led this humanitarian task force in Geneva, where all of the members of the International Syria Support Group sat at the table, including Russia and Iran and the US and the others. And we had Russian military and diplomats at the Russian colonels at the table, and we negotiated hundreds of convoys, deconflicted convoys into besieged areas, evacuation agreements from many places where people ended up in Idlib and so on. It's possible the Russians would be a counterpart for those agreements, as we need now full steam on the diplomatic front for the ceasefire and talks about the diplomatic solutions to the conflict issues.
Well, there is a point, I think, that needs to be raised, and I'm very pleased to see Ambassador Axel Marschak of Austria, because he raised it with me, and so I'm going to sort of speak for him on this. There is a point in all conflicts where the stronger side, and in this case, clearly the aggressor, will find it opportune for themselves to seek a pause. It could be that they have prisoners of war that they want to see exchanged. It could be that they want to see an exchange of dead bodies, as we see, and we set up these commissions. But there will be a point where there is a sort of an internal need within the Russian Federation to see a pause take place. And I suppose all of us would agree that at that stage, the UN has to be ready and has to have already thought ahead of time what it's planning to do, and then correspondingly what it's going to ask in terms of further deconfliction. Is that right?
Indeed, and even before that point, I mean, deconfliction just means we tell, today we got, actually, there may be some interference on, and I'm sorry for that. Today we got the request actually from the attacking side for information on where we have warehouses and offices in Severodonetsk. We've already reported that. We will report it many places. The deconfliction thing needs to be set up, and needs to be set up also for hospitals and so on. We cannot presume that the P5 wants to bomb hospitals. All of these facilities should be deconflicted, and the UN should put it up as a real system immediately.
Okay. I'd like to touch on one point before we bring this to a close. In my capacity as the militant member of the elders, we issued an appeal for a tribunal to be set up for the prosecution of the Russian leadership responsible for the crime, the state act of aggression, crime of aggression. Karen mentioned this as being one of the UN imperatives. And then we go into this discussion, and we had this discussion about how humanitarian access becomes, of course, then a tradable commodity in the manner by which you move from humanitarian access to then some sort of early political settlement. What's the danger that this issue, the accountability criminal justice issue, also becomes a tradable commodity in that mix? Karen suggested that it often does. Yeah? And to what extent, given the savagery of what we're seeing, can we accept that?
Well, if I may say, I mean, I think first thing is it shouldn't stop us pursuing it, but I think it may be human rights organizations like my own which push this ultimately more than governments at this stage, because I think in these early stages, the glories of setting up any new category of crime, let alone a new tribunal to prosecute it, is such a sort of multi-year process that, you know, there is plenty of advocacy power in this idea before it becomes something that might really impinge on Putin's willingness to step down the conflict. So I think, you know, we should not hold back, just as we shouldn't hold back from Russian suspension from the Human Rights Council. You know, these should be powerful advocacy targets. And I don't think if down the road there is a peace agreement which lets them fall away, that is necessarily defeat. I think that shows that these threats had some real force to them. But I wish I felt we were going to arrive at that point. And I could just add one other point, because, you know, having learnt my sort of diplomacy at the art of the master, Kofi, as many of us did, you know, I watched a level of engagement in these crises, which both mobilized his internal lieutenants, that Jan, then head of OCHA, or others, as well as their political counterparts. A man who would call the principals on all sides, take back the ideas to these senior lieutenants, and there would be a process, there would be a critical path to securing something. I have to say, and this did not start under the current Secretary General, but goes back to his predecessor, I fear that Secretary General's good offices have moved from sort of a demonstration of access to strategy and away from strategies of influence. I just feel that Secretary Generals now, you know, call the principals, say how you're doing, any way we can help, call back in a week or two's time to show that access still prevails. But there is none of the mobilization of a real strategy to drive an outcome that characterized that period of UN leadership. And I think that, to be honest, is real disappointing. And having said that, I'm not sure it would prevail in this particular situation. It may still be too big a thing to bite off. But, you know, the UN has sort of lost its muscle around this kind of integrated approach to conflict resolution.
Karen?
A word on that point, thinking back to the many recommendations, or the Hippo report from 2015 on peace operations, whose prime recommendation was to keep at the forefront the primacy of politics. And as you said, Jan, there aren't humanitarian solutions to humanitarian problems. I would like to think that there is active scenario planning taking place now, not only around Ukraine, but around all the other crises in the UN Secretariat. But I don't feel confident of that. I sense that the bandwidth isn't there. And the reality is that some of these situations have gone on for decades, and really the grip needs to be kept on pursuing them and building up towards a solution. You talked about the tyranny of time, essentially, but we have to be ready to invest for a longer period in resolving some of these situations. Not only invest ourselves, if I can use that about the UN, but Mark mentioned ICRC and other players at different moments in the crises or the unfolding of the situation. It may be right for other actors to take a lead for a certain time, but I would like to think that the UN always has the reins in its hand in some way.
I certainly remember when Lakhdar Brahimi came to brief the Security Council in 2014, and we went around the room in informal consultations, and 2 or 3 of the ambassadors said to Lakhdar, what do you propose the council does at this moment? We were completely paralyzed in the council. And Lakhdar, in his sort of gentle way, basically pushed back and said, essentially, you are the Security Council, do your job. Right? You don't just throw everything to us, do your job. And I thought to myself, well, he's right and he's sort of wrong as well, because it's precisely because we are in that state. There's this enormous opportunity for the Secretariat to contrive of different ideas which they could sell not to the council directly, because there will be a procedural objection, but to the 15 members separately, and that there's a space that can be cultivated. And I think that's essentially, even at the most perilous moment or the most paralyzed moment, there is opportunity to put and inject a new idea, which then opens the space. But it requires a dynamism, I think, and that's what we have to hope will come to pass. We have a few minutes left. We have a gallery of very distinguished permanent representatives with us. I wanted to ask if any of them have a question they'd like to pose to the panelists before we close. And can I turn the floor to the Ambassador of Croatia, Ivan Simonovic, who also used to head the Human Rights Office here in New York a few years ago.
Thank you.
Ivan, if you'd come and speak at the podium so that you could be on camera as well. You need to turn around.
Mark, you mentioned that we need United Nations as an impartial truth teller. But Zaid, you mentioned that as of 2014, we had UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, first reporting every month and then less often, but also OHCHR every month reporting to the Security Council, invited to brief on a situation in Ukraine. At a certain point of time, we were not anymore welcomed as OHCHR to brief Security Council. Karin, do you think it was a mistake by the Security Council? Do you think that enabled Russian leadership to develop narrative about atrocity crimes being perpetrated in Ukraine, including alleged genocide? What to do in order to have not only the impartial UN truth tellers, but that they are heard and that they are in a position to share their truth in Ukraine as well as in future conflicts and similar situations that are escalating. Thank you.
Mark.
My sort of, if you like, sort of max 30,000 foot argument is that, just as I feel that the Security Council no longer deserves to be the arbiter of humanitarian operations and those should go back to international law, I feel as their basis, I feel similarly that a broken Security Council cannot be the ultimate client for human rights reporting. I think we have to reinvent human rights reporting much more along the lines of what the dynamic NGOs in the sector, Human Rights Watch, but also lots of local groups in Syria or now Ukraine do, and be much quicker to put verified reporting, verified, mind you, reporting including video, out on the internet to the public. Because, you know, I think the final step in this sort of loss of the political side of the UN that we will encounter is the UN, for its survival, will need to make a much more dynamic partnership with civil society than it is typically held, because it has got to recover a place. If it's not going to be the political deal maker, then it's got to position itself as the voice of conscience around the Charter commitments. And that includes, you know, calling out human rights abuses around the world in partnership with civil society. So I think you've got to reinvent how you report.
Thank you, Mark. Any other questions? Jukka, please, the Ambassador of Finland. Lithuania, sorry, so sorry. I'm
Yes, Lithuania. Well,
I'm so sorry.
well, sincerely, thank
Jukka,
you.
you were sitting in front of me, so my apologies.
Right. Yeah. Well, sincerely, thank you for this really very valuable insights. And obviously, Lithuania is very close to this conflict, also geographically. My question is, it really goes with your response about the expectation management, also from the public society. Well, public attention and time span is also rather limited, and there are so many distractions. And so how meaningfully, when you spoke about the communication, reinventing the communication, and right now I'm also bombarded with so many requests and also all the blames of the UN for the inactivity, on how realistically to craft the message, what exactly is feasible within these diplomatic frameworks, certain realistic assessment of the time frame, and again, without inflated hope, but still really to make this good understanding that okay, these conflicts are up to the resolution. So,
Karen.
Look, I would stand by my recommendation that the UN needs to be an impartial truth teller, even when it is uncomfortable to tell these truths. But I don't think anything it can do will ensure that these things are heard, whether it's by the Security Council, which is a political body, or by the public at large, because we have short memories and fatigue sets in relatively quickly. So I think this is one of the built-in dilemmas, unless the UN is also willing to draw the historical lessons from what they're seeing. That is where we connect the findings to the scenarios based on what we've learned in the past. Very few people alive today remember the circumstances under which the UN was founded. And I think it is one of the core jobs of the UN to remind us again and again of why it matters and what it's supposed to be doing.
Yes. No, I was startled a few years ago to experience two very detailed analyses of two enormous UN failures, but they happened outside the UN. The UN has never really gone deep into the failures that it's experienced in the past. It's done outside, and it needs to somehow happen within. Could I finally turn Ambassador Venovas? I think he took off. He was asking for the floor, or he's not here. Okay.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to see you back, Mark, and thanks for your comment. I had two quick points. One is on your comment of the UN becoming a farce. You know, I think some people are concerned that Russia may not come back to the UN. We are at this point much more concerned that the UN will be a very diminished institution by the time that they do come back. So I think one of the lessons for us is also, you've talked very convincingly about this being a new dimension, and I think we have to think about, you know, new responses from our side, also diplomatically. And we need to think about alternatives to Security Council action very clearly. The second point, you know, you talked about the food security issue and how that impacts the entire world. I think that is extremely important also in our narrative, but it's not only playing in our favor. You know, we see signs from the Russian side to use this as, you know, as a point in their narrative. And I think we also need to do a far better job in explaining to the global South countries why we do believe this is a very different dimension of conflict. We had a very strong vote in the General Assembly, but it's not as good a vote as it could have been. We had 141 in favor is very good. As importantly, the 5 votes against were extremely important because everybody knows who Russia's friends are now, but we could have done better. And I think that's a very important point that we need to do, focus on politically and diplomatically. Thank you so much.
Could I bring just pick up from Christian's point and say, of course, all crises need to be resolved. All crises have humanitarian suffering that needs to be alleviated. But not all crises can threaten nuclear war, right? So is that a valid point Christian's making?
I think it's hugely valid. And, I'm so glad, by the way, that Christian mentioned the General Assembly vote, because we would have not done justice to the UN to talk about the reaction without mentioning the 141, which is a remarkable number versus the 100 after Crimea, etc. But, it does still show a divided world. One advocacy organization counted it up in population terms and had 52% of the world still abstaining, 41% of the world voting for that 141. So, there's still a job to be done in terms of, arriving at a common global understanding. But what a United for Peace resolution approach did in the General Assembly was show, I think, quite convincingly global moral outrage, versus the sort of cynical gridlock of the council. So I think that is, key. So when one says the UN is diminished, I think one's got to be careful and say, for now, the council is diminished. And that is a very, very important distinction as we go, to go to Ambassador Lithuania's point, yes, the attention to the crisis of the day, Ukraine, and the terrible thing will slip away as it did for Afghanistan and has done throughout all our careers. But because unfortunately this crisis is going to go through many more chapters of a widening confrontation between Russia and the West, and a economic crisis and probably consequent political crisis in many countries of the rest, this is going to be, I would suspect, the defining crisis for all of us in our careers as citizens of our countries. I'd like to, if I may, just finish where I began. This just is not any ordinary war. This is upending the whole international system with, dramatic consequences for the UN, but for all of us as citizens of wherever we come from in the world as well.
With that sobering and wise remark, I'd like to, first of all, thank all the distinguished ambassadors who've joined us. And in particular, I'd like to also thank the President of the Security Council for being here. And most of all, of course, want to thank the distinguished panelists. And we've lost Jan, who had another meeting. We're very grateful that you've taken time out to be with us. And perhaps we can do this again in the next few months and take stock of where we are and further reflect on how the UN could stop this, as we said, stop the war, save lives, and see justice done. Thank you so much, and thank you all for attending, and thank you the online audience for watching as well. Thank you.